Welcome to the second episode of Monsters Visualised, the series where I use AI to give us a glimpse at creatures from British folklore that deserve to be seen. In this episode, I'll be covering the next 4 legends I originally made radio plays out of for the channel. So, sit back and enjoy seeing everything from a haunted London townhouse to a murderous hobgoblin. 50 Berkeley Square is an interesting example of a very haunted house in a posh bit of London. Thomas Myers was a strange man and lived at that house from around 1859. Supposedly, he was rejected by his bride-to-be, and this sent his mind into a downward spiral, choosing to sleep all through the day and only appear at night. This strange behaviour was noticed by other local residents, and soon other rumours began to spread about the building. There are numerous stories that arose from this time period, including one about a man who was locked in the attic and only fed through a small hole in the door, an apparition of a young woman who threw herself out of an upper floor window out of despair after being abused, and a tale of a young girl who was killed by the family servant of the house at the time. This notoriety inspired people to test the validity of these stories, and even go so far as to make up wholly fictional works about the house. I discuss all of these in more detail in the specific radio drama episode for 50 Berkeley Square, so if that sounds interesting to you, please go and check that out. This legend also has a particular significance for me, as it's the first time I went out into the real world to find out a bit more about a story. If you follow me on Instagram, you know that I also like old books, and it so happens that a seller of rare books called Mags Bros was based at this address. However, once I looked into it a little further, it turned out that they moved premises some time ago, but the employee I spoke to at the shop told me a bit more about working at 50 Berkeley Square and confirmed that he had never seen anything supernatural, although at times he did find it a bit creepy. That's a lot of preamble, so on to the images. For this story, I wanted to try and capture the feeling of walking down a street of Victorian London by yourself at night, and having this supposedly haunted house almost jump out at you. I stuck with Turner's style for generating these pictures as, especially in the dark, the AI uses light really well in order to create a nice, mysterious effect. This one was relatively simple to do, all things considered. I started off with simple prompts like dark, Mayfair, Victorian townhouse, things like that, and it worked pretty well. I liked how most of these looked, but I really liked the ones with more verticality, as these better represent the actual buildings I'm trying to imitate. I made some variations with the taller buildings in mind and ended up creating the one I really like. The final image has the shape of the building I wanted as well as the railings along the street. On top of that, the way the main light source in the picture is seemingly coming from the house draws your attention to that particular part and caught my attention in the same way as people who thought they saw a ghost in the top window. This is obviously still a bit muddy and up for interpretation due to the style I was specifying, but I promise later on I experiment with different styles and come up with some interesting results. The Drummer of Tedworth was a real turning point for me and what I was doing with the channel. This is the first video I attempted some proper sound design with. It was just small things like a gunshot sound effect and stuff like that, but it really got me thinking about the different ways I could present stories and the techniques I could use to achieve them. The reason I decided to put in this extra bit of effort is because The Drummer of Tedworth is quite a special story. As far as I can work out, this is the first recorded poltergeist in England, so I'm surprised it's not more widely talked about. The record of this haunting comes from a book called A Blow at Modern Seducism, in some philosophical considerations about witchcraft and the famed disturbance at the house of M. Mompesson, with reflections on drollery and the anhitimi. I struggle with that word. This was written by a man called Joseph Glanville and published in 1668. Joseph Glanville was a man who was essentially the first ghost hunter in England, or witch hunter, trying to prove or disprove their actual existence. The account details the occurrences at the house of John Mompesson that supposedly started happening after he confiscated a drum off a beggar called William Drury and had the man put in jail. The story of the hauntings is very long and I go into all the detail in my original video, but the highlights include a ghostly drumming that was heard nightly at the house, the children of the family being thrown from their beds, and a sulphurous smell. I think the most interesting happening was that the family Bible kept getting thrown into the ashes of the fireplace, and after Montpesson heard whispering coming from that same fireplace, he fired his pistol into it and it drew blood from something invisible. Apparently, while in prison, William Drury boasted about causing the hauntings, and after his release, it was suspected that whenever he left the country, the hauntings would die down, but whenever he would return, they would start straight back up again. Of course, this is an incredibly old account, but the detail recorded is fairly astounding. Nowadays, there are plenty of ways we can easily explain away most of the supernatural goings-on, but it's a good story nonetheless. As it is a classic kind of ghost story, I wanted to do one final classic style of picture before moving on to something else. So, here we have an old house that is clearly being haunted by some kind of dark entity. I was actually really happy with how these beginning ones turned out, but I wanted more detail or more interaction between the demonic ghostly figure and the house itself. Trying again, I kind of got more of what I wanted, with the supernatural fog beginning to flow around the scene, but I felt the bedroom just wasn't looking real enough. In the next attempt, I went too far the other way and got a bedroom I was happier with, but practically lost all of the ghost-like figure. Eventually, I got this middle ground, with the ghostly figure coming into this bedroom from who knows where, with their wispy essence seemingly flowing throughout the entirety of the house. As I upscaled this picture, I was faced with an interesting feature of the AI. With Midjourney, you can upscale the original 4 images several times, and each time you do, it gets more detailed. You also have some other options of a lighter upscaling, and playing around with this led me to these 2 images. Although the first is slightly less detailed, I think it works better in capturing the ghostly feeling of the poltergeist than the second, which, despite having a greater level of detail, works less well as you lose some of that mystery. The Edinburgh Dolls are a collection of 17 hand-carved wooden figures that were found in a cave on Arthur's Seat, which is a big hill just outside of the city. After they were discovered in 1836 by a group of boys hunting rabbits, rumours started to spread about them, including how some of the dates written on the boxes the dolls were found in correlated with deaths in a specific Edinburgh family. The most interesting rumour was that they were linked to the infamous grave robbers turned murderers Burke and Hare, who were speculated to make each doll after killing each of their victims. In truth, they were probably honorific burials for sailors or something like that, but we don't actually know. In any case, I thought for these I would try going for something a little different. I gave simple instructions for the dolls covered in dirt, trying to imagine what these things could have looked like coming out of the ground when the boys found them. Given that they are now in a museum, I really liked the framing of all the pictures, and it's almost as if they are caked in mud while still on display somewhere. I thought the bottom 2 pictures captured the simplistic idea of the dolls best, and so upscaled both of them to get my final 2 images. However, while I'm really happy with how these turned out, I think this is one of the rare occasions where we actually have pictures of the subject of the legend. To be honest, I think the dolls are creepy enough in real life, so there isn't really much need for my artistic interpretation, but it was a fun one to do anyhow. Finally, we have Bloody Bones. This creature goes by many different names and inhabits differing places depending on where the story is being told. I won't go into all of them now, as it varies from being a water demon to a dancing skeleton with no head, but it's a great one to look into for yourself. The version I made my original video about was a telling given by the writer Ruth Tongue. Essentially, this is probably the story I've told the worst out of all of the videos I've made on these kind of topics. Normally I go into the source material, as website retellings of these legends always end up slightly varied, and so it's often easiest to get a coherent narrative from an account given in the 1800s by someone who has visited the site of the haunting or whatever it is, and then they've gone and written it down. The issue with using Ruth Tongue's retelling of the story is that she is a folklorist who has come under massive scrutiny since her death, as the tales she wrote about often came from her own memory or experiences from when she was a child. Because of this, the validity of these is sometimes questionable, but for whatever reason I rushed my Bloody Bones video out, and so I didn't look into it properly. With that in mind, just take all of this going forward with a pinch of salt. But despite all of that, the description she gives of this creature is still somewhat massively terrifying. She describes it as a dreadful, crouching creature that hides in dark cupboards or under stairs atop a pile of bones of its previous victims, peeking out through cracks and doors looking for who it's going to get next. The first thing I wanted to do was to try and visualize the nest of bones this creature sits on, and so attempted that using the art style of Zdzisław Beksiński. This was a Polish painter, best known for creating nightmarish hellscapes. He never said there was any meaning behind his paintings, but I think if you look at them, what is clear is that growing up through World War II and the Soviet occupation of Poland and seeing the horror that came along with that undoubtedly influenced him. There is a YouTube channel called In Praise of Shadows, and they did a brilliant breakdown on him, which I would highly recommend if you like his kind of art style and want to know more about this incredible painter. In any case, I thought the twisted mix of viscera and bone that is so common in his paintings would also work really well for bloody bones. I did keep running into this issue with the AI where it kept trying to place the figure outside rather than inside a cupboard, but eventually I started to get more interior images generating. However, I think probably because of the nature of Beksiński's work, I couldn't get a clear figure to generate, as evidenced by my many failed attempts. To be honest, the results I got were really interesting, and it actually helped me to realise the extent and way in which Midjourney will emulate an artist. But due to this, rather than trying to force something that clearly wasn't going to happen, I would instead try something a little bit different. Before I did though, I upscaled this image as it's a really disturbing mix of the inside of a cupboard or basement with this murky, unknown landscape beyond, which I thought perhaps captured a nest Bloody Bones might make in an abandoned building or something like that. Well, that's all good and well, but what about the actual creature? The landscape is cool and all, but I wanted to give this terrifying boogeyman a face we could all be scared by. This ended up being a proper journey. I started off trying to generate a hunched over gargoyle-looking demon, but the emphasis was clearly too much on gargoyle, and so I had to change my approach. I now went for something more along the lines of a demon in the dark, but clearly I wasn't specific enough about it being a solitary entity, and so ended up with these quite cool looking demon horde scenes which are nice, but just not what I was going for. Ultimately, I found that if I specified that I wanted a close-up of a singular demon, this got me to where I wanted to be. I then made variations of the one on the bottom right, as I thought that was a nice mix of human and nightmare, and then took that forward. From here I made more variations and was pretty happy, but wanted to know if I could focus more on the teeth of Bloody Bones. However, this took me down a totally different path and made everything kind of look a bit like a cat, so I backtracked and instead upscaled one of the previous images, and I think it ended up looking absolutely terrifying. I wanted to do another bonus image for the end of the video, and tried several things after writing the script for this episode. At first I thought it would be interesting to try and create the bleeding fireplace, but one of the banned words when using the AI is blood plus fireplace seemed to be a difficult one for the AI to handle as the fire was just going everywhere. Instead, I tried to focus on the Bible that was found and got some interesting photorealistic results, but I didn't think this was an interesting enough thing to end the video on, so I wanted to keep going. I then completely dropped that idea, reread the script again, and decided to reimagine Burke and Hare in the style of Beksiński. I think this ended up being an amazing interpretation of his work, and a totally different way of imagining a story I'm sure we've all heard before. I think it's great how the AI managed to generate these shady figures wearing cloaks digging up a grave by the source of that single candle or something in the middle. It's a really great atmosphere, and I thought it'd be a nice way to end the video. With that all said and done, thank you so much for watching the video. These are great fun to make, so if you want to see more stuff like this, please let me know. I'm going to be away now until early September, but fingers crossed I might be able to do some on-location stuff while I'm away, so hopefully when I'm back there'll be some of that to look forward to, but no promises, that'll all just depend on weather and what I can get booked. In any case, that's enough talking from me. I will talk to you again in the next one. Bye bye.